Hey, everybody. Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Eat, Drink, and Be Merry show with Nancy and Lisa. Today, we're so excited because we're going to Kentucky's Bourbon Country with Karl Raitz. Karl is an author and a professor emeritus of geography at the University of Kentucky. So he knows all about geography, and he's going to teach us how geography really connects with the world of bourbon in Kentucky. He is the co-editor of The Great Valley Road of Virginia. He's the co-author of Rock Fences of the Bluegrass and author of Making Bourbon. His latest book is Bourbon's Backroads, a journey through Kentucky's distilling landscape, and it's published, same as Making Bourbon, published through the University Press of Kentucky. We love university presses. They do such amazing work across the country. So I encourage you to go to their website, KentuckyPress.com. Of course, you can get his books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all those great sites too. But welcome, Karl. How are you doing out in Kentucky?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoying the beginning of cooler fall weather here.
Yeah, I bet it gets beautiful. We were in Kentucky, in central Kentucky, visiting our friend in Springfield. Central Kentucky's, she was like, we're the heart of bourbon, horses, and history. And it was mid-August of 2019, and we didn't get to stay very long, but we could see just a hint of fall coming in. So it seems like you get beautiful 4 seasons in Kentucky.
Yes, we do. We're far enough north so we get the 4 seasons, but not so far south that we get the heat and bugs and so on of the deep south states.
We went around, it was actually pouring rain. Right now we're recording while we're in Nashville because we travel full time, but it was pouring rain when we got to Springfield, and she took us through Bardstown, and just even driving the back roads of Kentucky on our way there, while we were there on our way out. It's really, Kentucky is a beautiful state, but it's really interesting to see how the cities have built up, how the bourbon country, you could be often like rolling grass of the bluegrass, right? The rolling farmlands, but then you'll get like the more newer bourbon and distilleries. So it's kind of an interesting blend that you have in the state.
Yes. If I could put a little historical context into your comment, in 1800, the government tabulated over 2,000 distilleries in the state of Kentucky. Today, there are 65 to 70. There are 6, 7, or 8 old historic distilleries that are of industrial size that are still operating, some of which you may have seen in your trip to Springfield. But there's a lot of new startups, as you suggest. So if you drive to Bardstown, which is not very far north of Springfield, that town bills itself as the bourbon capital of the world. Sign outside of town that tells you that as you arrive on US 31. There are some historic distilleries operating both in Bardstown and in close proximity, but there are also some brand new distilleries, craft distilleries they're called, that are operating in and among the older work. So there's a very interesting blend of times and technologies operating in the same place now at the same time.
So what is it about Kentucky that drew all these bourbon makers?
Well, there's the key question right there. You have to ask yourself, why is it here? There are some historical dimensions to this that I can chat about that are outlined in both the Bourbon Backroads book and in the larger Making Bourbon book. And the question, if you visit the distilleries and you listen to the narratives of the guides that take you around and introduce you to the topic, is that it's largely has to do with the so-called pure water. So if you look at that in some detail, you find, yes, Kentucky has between 40 and 50 inches of rainfall annually, so it's well watered. the area of north central Kentucky that we refer to as the Greater Bluegrass region. It's, by the way, geologically related to the Nashville Basin, just to our south, is underlain with limestone rock. And when the rainwater hits the surface, part of it runs off in surface streams and part of it percolates down to form groundwater. And that flows along cracks and crevices in the limestone, creates caves and caverns and sometimes very large springs. And those springs historically have been the sites of towns. Harrodsburg was built at Harrodsburg Spring. Georgetown was built at Royal Spring, some 1,000 gallons per minute issue in Royal Spring. So Royal Spring became also the site not only of the town of Georgetown, but Elijah Craig's distillery, which is often credited with being one of the first, if not the first, distilleries in Kentucky. That's a question that really can't be answered with any accuracy. We don't know who was the first distiller. There were so many to choose from. But one of the reasons then that they were here is because of the availability of water. You have to be careful with the word pure when you're referring to water, because water falling through the atmosphere as rain is going to be soft water. And it's going to be relatively pure unless you have a modern industrial atmosphere that it's falling through, in which case you're going to pick up particulates and so on. But if you go back a couple of hundred years, water falling through the atmosphere is going to be reasonably pure. But once it hits the ground and once it infiltrates into the bedrock, into the limestone, it's going to start picking up minerals and all kinds of organic and inorganic material. And so, including iron, by the way. And so if you bring that premise down to the 1950s, I'm skipping way ahead here, but the Kentucky Geological Survey did a series of studies of Kentucky's water supply in the 1950s and 1960s. And they did samples of a number of wells that were used by industrial distillers for their water supply. And they found, as you would expect, it wasn't, quote, pure water, unquote. It had a lot of calcium carbonate in it, and in some cases even had higher iron content than was recommended. So the other part of that question about the water and the limestone bedrock, which is the explanation that you often hear, is, well, what about other places that also have limestone bedrock, that also have a lot of rainfall? Why weren't they major centers? So if you look at the Nashville Basin, for example, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Nashville Basin is underlined with limestone, very much like the Bluegrass Basin is. But the distilling industry in the Nashville Basin is minor to almost non-existent, with the exception of a few distilleries, some of which are very well known. If you look at the Great Valley of Virginia, and actually here we're talking in part about the Shenandoah Valley, but also the valley extension north of that, and then south of that into upper East Tennessee. That's limestone for over 300 miles. There are very few distilleries historically, and none that I know of contemporarily, unless there are some new craft startups there. Well, why isn't that the distilling capital of America instead of central Kentucky, if a lot of water and limestone are the answers? And you could look at some other questions. Well, maybe it's the grain supply, because distillers are going to be consuming large quantities of grain once they reach the industrial distilling threshold. In other words, part of the premise of both of the books, Bourbon Backroads and Making Bourbon, is to closely examine this transition between the craft distillers, the farmers, the millers, the frontier folk that were here in the first decade of settlement, already making whiskey and using the local corn, local grain as their distilling medium. And the transition from that to the full bore industrial distillery that is run by steam engines that line the Ohio River at Louisville and so forth, and that come down to modern day. How does that transition take place is one of the major themes of the two books. Well, pardon me, when that transition takes place, you are going from distillers who are consuming local grain, maybe their own, if they're a farmer distiller, local grain produced by their neighbors, perhaps, a short distilling season, maybe November to March, something like that. And then they're working on their farms. They're working, if they're also millers, and they're a miller distiller. So we have farmer distillers, we have miller distillers, and the miller has other business to do, milling products, milling grain during the remainder of the year. So that all becomes big industrial distilling, and industrial distilling is going to consume an enormous amount of grain, especially corn, but also rye and wheat and barley. So doesn't it make sense then, if you're asking the question, why is distilling in Kentucky, to think of the question in terms of, well, what is your grain supply? Your grain supply is critical. So are you producing enough grain in order to feed these large industrial distilleries? Well, we know that the Corn Belt is north of Kentucky, is not part of the Corn Belt. It stretches from Ohio through Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, southern Minnesota, and so on. And the heart, if we can say it that way, the central region of high grain production historically in the 19th century was central Illinois, an area called the Grand Prairie. If you're familiar with Peoria, Illinois, Peoria is on the south side of the Grand Prairie, and the Illinois River flows right through downtown Peoria on its way to the Mississippi, not far from St. Louis. Well, that is the heart of the Corn Belt. That's where the grain is being produced in very large quantities in the 19th century. So wouldn't it make sense that we would have a distilling industry in Peoria, Illinois, or surrounds? Well, it turns out not only was that the case, but Peoria was producing more whiskey than any place in the United States by about 1880, 1890.
Oh, wow.
Downtown Peoria had more than a dozen major industrial distilleries standing side by side along the Illinois River. So that makes the circle back around to, well, where does Kentucky stand then in terms of becoming the center for bourbon production if you have this major competing area over in the heart of the Corn Belt where the grain is being produced? So, you know, that still teases around the question, well, why is it here? Because the water question doesn't answer it. The grain availability question does not answer it either. So that is the answer. Well, the best answer that I can provide, and that we discuss in the two books, is it's more the people and the earliest distillers here were Scots-Irish, who were bringing a tradition of 1,000 years of distilling from Ireland and Scotland to the Eastern United States, or the Eastern colonies, if we back it up a few generations. And they started distilling in the very early colonies. George Washington famously made whiskey Paul Revere was in the business of making vessels out of copper that people could use to distill with, in addition
Wow.
to the things that he's known.
Good for him.
He's a busy man.
And so you have folk along the colonial littoral, we would say, that joint on the East Coast between the saltwater and the land and that early colonial area, gradually moving west. And Kentucky was known, it had a reputation by the 1760s, 1770s as being the best land west of the Appalachians. There had been enough explorers that had made it past the Appalachians to the west, that had found the Bluegrass Basin and realized the potential for agriculture and the good life more generally. And so that encouraged people to obtain land grants from their political friends. It encouraged people without those connections to move west and try to obtain land, find activities that they could do that would give them a livelihood. And among that group were some early distillers.
Mm.
Now, if we add one more dimension to that, and that is before a lot of people got to central Kentucky, they were also inhabiting the Trans-Appalachian West in Western Pennsylvania, along the tributaries of what is going to be called the Ohio River. So the Monongahela River country south of present-day Pittsburgh was a very popular settlement area initially, until Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, declares that there needs to be a tax on distilled product to help pay.
No.
And we're still paying that tax. Thank you very much.
And, it's been off and on over the decades, and the tax, as we all know right now, is pretty stout. Continuing the tradition on. Well, the farmer distillers and the miller distillers of Western Pennsylvania did not appreciate Hamilton's suggestion that they pay taxes. And so some 2,000 of those folks left. They pulled up stakes and got beyond the reach of the federal enforcers. And many of those folks moved to central Kentucky. And so you have East Coast potential distillers coming in the form of Scots-Irish, and in some cases, Belgian, German, French distillers as well. But then you have this secondary group coming from Pennsylvania, and they're all coalescing here in central Kentucky. So that historic impetus, if you will, generation after generation of people, first in Europe and then on the East Coast and then in Pennsylvania, now finding themselves in central Kentucky. And as I said a few minutes ago, 2,000 of them are registered by the government in 1800 as official distillers. That means that the federal government knew where they were and were paying taxes. That does not count all of the illegal distillers.
Shiners.
Absolutely, and there were a lot of them.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about those folks, in part because we don't know how many they were. We don't know what their production was or any of that. So what we're going with here is what we have a better idea about, which is the official numbers that were counted. So when you come down to the bottom of the funnel of the question, why is distilling in Kentucky? I apologize for this long explanation, but to my way of understanding all of this, the primary reason is this historical inertia of interest and expertise, but also embedded in that is a long-standing interest in producing the best quality whiskey you can. There was a certain amount of pride that distillers took in their product, not just producing volumes of whiskey, You could do that at large places that we may have discussed a few minutes ago, not to mention names again. But distillers were very proud of the fact that their whiskey might be highly regarded by the folks that bought it and compared favorably with that produced by their neighbors or somebody in another county several miles away. So that concern for quality is enumerated again and again and again when you look at individual distillery records, for example, which the larger book, the Making Bourbon book, deals with at some length. And it explains how one of our leading distillers in the 19th century, Henry McKenna, who's featured in 2 chapters of the Making Bourbon book and about 5 pages in the shorter Bourbon Backroads book. Henry McKenna's distillery was about 20 miles north of Bardstown in Nelson County, in a small town there. And Henry McKenna was receiving mail order letters from people up and down the Great Plains, Kansas, Texas, throughout the southeastern states, from the Middle West, as far away as Minnesota to the Northwest. And this is in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And they're asking for his best whiskey very often. And people who had wherewithal, attorneys, high-income folks, bankers, and so on, were writing him letters on their letterhead saying, have you got any 10-year-old? Have you got any 12-year-old? What is your best whiskey? Please send me a barrel, a smaller barrel, not the full-size barrel, or send me some bottles, and so on and so forth. So there is good evidence that suggests that distillers were very keen on producing, the Kentucky distillers were very keen on producing the highest quality product that they could. And their reputation was polished and burnished by that, as suggested by those letters that.
So it's interesting too, because of the marketing. It's like they started marketing early and it's still continuing today, even though you have industrialization and even the bourbon industry itself kind of created the villages. And that was interesting to me, reading about how, let's go bring hogs here. We can do it cheaper, and hogs could be used to eat the slop and the corn and, all of we can do this better than what they're doing over here. So they were all thinking about how to almost build the villages, if you will. And then even if they got bigger, they were holding on to their recipes. It seemed like they wanted to keep that recipe pure, but still become bigger with it. And a lot of times when you expand, you lose quality, but it seems that no matter what, they're keeping that quality at the forefront.
Right. And that business of quality and the family recipe or the secret recipe or the secret ingredients, yeast making was a major activity by many distillers. And many of the early distillers from Europe had served apprenticeships, I should say. They served as apprentices to distillers in Ireland or in Scotland or in France. And sometimes they were assigned to make yeast. And yeast these days is something you can go buy off the shelf, and it will arrive in a sack or in a carton of some kind. And you have different yeasts to choose from. Well, historically, a lot of distillers, and we explain this in detail in the Making Bourbon book, a lot of distillers made their own yeast. And that adds further to the secret recipe issue, because they would not necessarily share their yeast with their neighbors or competing distillers. And an interesting sub-point to that is, when you think of ingredients in whiskey, there are not very many. They're grain starch, it boils down to, whether it's corn or wheat or rye or barley or malted barley. But something that I had not heard of before I started this work, and by the way, this is about a 10-year project, doing these two
A
bottles.
delicious project.
A lot of sampling.
I was used to thinking of hops as a product used by brewers, obviously. And that hop production, whether it's in this country or in Europe, almost seemed invariably to be something that was done on behalf of beer brewers. Well, I found out that some of the recipes used by Kentucky distillers to make yeast included hops. And so of the ingredients that they would buy on the open market, in addition to grain, they would be on the lookout for hops. And they weren't using it, as far as I can tell, as a flavoring for whiskey, as was used for beer manufacturing, but it was used as a collateral product in the making of their own yeast.
Wow.
So how does Kentucky compare, if it's now the world center of bourbon, how does it compare to where the recipes and the techniques actually came from, like Ireland and Scotland?
Mm.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the recipe part of this, but the one of the things to remember when we're comparing Irish and Scottish whiskey in the case of Ireland, Scotch in the case of Scotch, which is also whiskey, of course, with American bourbon, is that the grains used to make Irish whiskey and Scotch are probably going to be different than the grains used in Kentucky to make bourbon. By law, bourbon has to be made of a mash that is a minimum of 51% corn. And the remaining 49% can be whatever you want it to be as master distiller. It can be high rye with some malted barley. Malted barley is always included because of its enzyme activity in pulling the sugar out of the starch. Lost my train of thought there. But in Ireland or in Scotland, corn is going to be a minor ingredient in making whiskey, if at all. And it may be that in some cases, an Irish whiskey is all barley and malted barley. So malted barley is barley, but it's been processed, as you probably know, in a way that changes it dramatically. It's sprouted. Well, first of all, it's soaked in water. It's the highest quality barley that you can lay your hands on, number one. Number two, it's processed by soaking it in water, getting it so that it will begin to sprout. It's laid out on a floor. Sometimes the floor is heated in order to facilitate that sprouting. When it sprouts, it's then killed, so to speak, and the sprouting stops. When it's all dried, you mill it, and now you've got a product that is enzyme active, and it helps draw sugar out of the starch that you provided with your corn and your rye or your milled wheat. You probably know that there are several distillers. Maker's Mark is well known for barley. Rather than rye as a secondary ingredient, they're using wheat. The Weller name of another distiller is well known also as a wheated bourbon. Most other distilleries will feature rye instead of wheat. But the Irish and Scottish products would not have that full spectrum unless they imported a lot of grain. I don't think they're in the business of doing that, and they have this long tradition of doing it their way with
Mm.
grain products. So
Mm.
why change a winning formula?
Right. It's like everyone go visit each other. What I find interesting is that you've got, okay, the Irish and the Scottish, but you've also talked about the French, and then you've got the, folks from Belgium. And I'm thinking about the European countries that are not from Ireland and Scotland, the people coming from there, if their role played a lot into the yeast part because you think about winemaking over in France and the yeast. And I also know limestone was such a big deal for Burgundy and Pinot Noir, even in California. I know Central California, we're in a place, was Calera wine. We went and wine tasted there, and his whole key to making really good Pinot Noir was that they have a lot of lime. And he studied, and he's retired since, he studied in Burgundy, France. And he said that's what he learned. And France was about that, and then the yeast. So I wonder about the French and those from Belgium, because Belgium, you think about, brewing and beer. So I'm wondering if those, they brought those characteristics into play and those skills and traditions into bourbon making because of the yeast and the hops.
Yeah, it's entirely possible that France played a much bigger role in all of this historically than I'm aware of. The French, the Belgian folk that I came across were doing things like barrel making. They were employed as barrel makers, and there may well have been some yeast makers. In fact, I think there's a case in the Making Bourbon book of a yeast maker who was French I think it was in Lexington. It might have been else. There's a lot of information.
I mean, I think you've written the Bourbon Bible of Central Kentucky between the two books. I mean, it's like, you've got to read. I think reading Making Bourbon first or going through that, is a really good thing. I mean, because all the history of it, especially when you think about, it's 200 years of history of, it's like settling the land. Like people came here and settled over bourbon. And then you think about Prohibition and how they had to change then. We had a gentleman on our show, Stephanie, our friend from Springfield, brought on Nicholas Laraquenti, I think is, and he does bourbon archaeology. And we really wanted to see him, but our timing didn't work because he's finding these old, he's digging for distilleries across the state. But how fascinating, how they had to change and yet still hold on to these traditions, even, when they had to swap over to making industrial alcohol or during Prohibition. And of course, out in the backwoods under the light of the moon. Come on, that is you got to have that. If you take that away, that's the magic.
That's part of the fun.
Yeah.
Nicholas is a good friend of mine.
Ah, awesome.
And he's recently taken on a new job with Sazerac. Sazerac owns Buffalo Trace, Barton Distillery in Bardstown, and many other distilleries and brand names. And he's going to be he's an archaeologist, of course, but he's going to be their historian and their curator.
Awesome.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Both historical documents and the infrastructure that they have that is remaining at Buffalo Trace in Frankfurt, which is an exciting place to visit. Your listeners and your readers couldn't do better, I don't think, than starting off their tour of Kentucky bourbon country with a visit to Frankfurt and that Buffalo Trace archive. And by archive there, I mean the landscape that you see as you drive in, and then you take the tour and you realize that, they will tell you this, but some of the highest quality bourbon whiskey produced anywhere is produced right there on that site. And that site goes back historically through multiple generations to Eh Taylor, and then somebody even before him that have chosen to manufacture on that same site. And Nicholas had the good fortune to work in that site, working for the State Office of Historic Preservation, but then to dig up, if we can put it that way, that Bourbon Pompeii, as Mark Brown, the CEO of Sazerac, calls it, of all of those buried fermenting vats, for example.
Wow.
It's amazing.
How all of that was used and put together.
Wow. And so the copper, is that stayed throughout, that using, copper as is distilling? Because I mean, we've been to like Arkansas in Little Rock, there's a very first distiller, whiskey distiller, and he distills vodka and does gin, and he went through literal hell to actually become a distiller after Prohibition. And he's I encourage everyone to go right in downtown Little Rock, and then he had to go through a lot to open. It basically opened the doors to Arkansas, but there's such a huge deal to being back on track. And across the states, we've seen it, going through Prohibition, whether it's a winery, a distillery, to get back on track. So for Kentucky, what was it like? Since you had so many together, was it easier to say, okay, we're back in the bourbon business after Prohibition? I mean, that was really rude, Prohibition.
It broke their stride.
Yeah.
In a major way, if we can use that metaphor. And recovery, if you think about everything that the distillers lost going into Prohibition, they knew when the federal law was passed in 1919, and it was going to be enforced in 1920, they could see this coming. The temperance folks had been all over them for a generation, actually 2 generations before that.
Wow.
So, and a large number of Kentucky counties were dry. So here you have a major distilling industry in a state that is heavily favored in many sectors by the dry folks, the temperance folks. And so they're struggling with this as they're going through the 19th and early part of the 20th century. It's a tough business without the temperance detractors. The farmers have crop failure. Well, where's your grain supply coming from? Markets have problems of one kind or another, and it's the case that some distilleries were bought and sold, restarted, maybe 20 times in 30 years.
Wow.
So in other words, each time that's bought and sold, there's a new distiller, there's a new owner, there's a new set of goals and objectives, maybe new recipes, and so on and so forth. So the continuity that's running through this is not continuity at all, it's discontinuity. It's a very difficult business environment, not for everyone. People like Henry McKenna went through it with hardly a hiccup, whereas others struggle continuously. And one of the sections of the Making Bourbon book is about a distiller, James Stone, who had a distillery called Elkhorn Creek in southern Scott County in the inner bluegrass, about 15 miles north of Lexington here. And he, unlike Henry McKenna, who did very well through all of this difficulty, James Stone struggled. And there are reasons why he failed ultimately and was bankrupt, lost everything. And Henry McKenna did not. Henry McKenna made it through, in part because he was able to pass things on to his family, in part because he was a good marketer. As you mentioned a little bit earlier, he was a pioneer in marketing. He would print up handouts, brochures, we might call them today, that he would take to medical conventions, because back then whiskey was considered medicinal.
Mm.
And so he was trying to foster the sale of his whiskey as a medicinal product for, quote, home use.
Right.
Meaning you got a sore throat, you took a little bourbon, or any other kind of malady, and people either didn't have quality medical care at the time, or they might have preferred home medical care rather than paying a physician who might not be able to produce the medicine that would do the trick.
Some things have not changed.
Yeah, even as we cross the country, we notice that some supermarkets will sell wine and beer, but not any kind of hard liquor at all.
Mm.
And then a state over, you can buy hard liquor in the supermarket. It's
That
very,
includes
very odd.
Kentucky. In Kentucky, some places you couldn't buy wine, or you'd have to go to the next county over. So that's what's interesting. Even in central Kentucky, I think even Springfield was dry, right? I think when we were there, I think it's changing, but it's interesting to me. But it's also interesting about, here's this quality and the recipes and this really rich heritage, and then here you have the Wild West. And so we've done a lot. I mean, that's our background in this country, is mostly in the Wild West, or Southwest. And so whiskey was a big deal. But like, there was one town, Yarrington. It had 3 names. This little town in Nevada, up in the Pony Express country, and one of the names was Pies and Switch, and it was because they would say, "Hey, come over. We're making whiskey," and the whiskey would have tobacco in it. They threw whatever they wanted in it. And so you didn't know, like, they would switch it on you. So they call it pies and poison. And there were Scotsmen out there too, by the way. And so you didn't know if you'd have a little bit of whiskey in there, but the rest was just, food coloring, and just, here it is. So back in the West, to really get whiskey way back when, if you think back in the 1800s, to get whiskey out there was not an easy task, and until the railroads. And then the railroads come, everybody's like, hooray, we can get oysters out in Tombstone, Arizona, we can get whiskey. So that's got to play also a big part of Kentucky, central Kentucky, getting it out to be nationally known and even internationally, is the railroads.
That's absolutely right. The one thing that Henry McKenna did, and a number of other distillers were so successful at, was marketing. And one of the reasons why their brochures made a difference was because they were doing this simultaneously with the development of the National Railroad grid. The hidden story behind everything that we've said so far is to make any of this work and to make a profit doing it, so you can sustain this as a business, you have to have infrastructure. And the most important part of the infrastructure early on is going to be transportation. So part of the issue is, how do we get grain from the farm to the distillery or any other market? How do we get livestock from the farm to wherever the market is? And the answer is, at first, well, we have to improve roads. So road making became a major business wherever you had this rural, urban, industrial business connection. And in Kentucky, that meant building toll roads, turnpikes. In other words, stone-covered roads that were actually built instead of just being tracks across the countryside.
Oh, wow.
This is what roads started as. So the great trails across the American West were not roads, they were tracks that were established by wagons passing back and forth over the same country over and over and over again. So you have these ruts, that's your road. The Santa Fe Trail was like that. There's no road. So one of the things that made distilling in Kentucky work was a very early push towards building high quality turnpike roads. And turnpikes are toll roads. So unfortunately, if you're going to use the road instead of a track across your neighbor's field, you're going to have to pay to do it. Secondly, and in Kentucky, this begins about 1830, is the coming of the steam-powered railroad. And 1830 marks the first railroad track in Kentucky between Lexington and Frankfort, and then Frankfort to Louisville. And of course, Louisville is on the Ohio River. So if you can run a track from the river, which is already in business with traffic going up and down river, to interior areas like Lexington and Bardstown and Frankfort and so on that are away from a major river, now you've got infrastructure building. And then as the technology of the railroad improves, the 1830 railroad didn't move much traffic. It was not mechanically sophisticated, let's put it that way. And the building materials, the iron tracks were brittle, they broke, and all kinds of problems. By 1870, a lot of that has been upgraded and fixed. You have powerful steam engines, locomotives, you have standardized switching, you have standardized car manufacturing. Pullman in Chicago was manufacturing passenger cars and so on.
Right.
The Bendix folks had invented the air brake, and that makes it possible to stop all of this once you get it going. And so once you achieve that threshold, now you can ship grain the distillers want, and you can bring it all the way from North Dakota. You don't have to have it on the neighboring farm. And you can bring malting barley from and North Dakota tends to be one of the good producers, as does Saskatchewan in Canada, where malting barley loves that kind of environment. It does not like the environment of the Deep South. And so materials of all kinds, plus the finished product, can now be moved any place you've got railroad tracks. So in terms of Nevada, having a switch and having whiskey available, there's a parallel there in Wyoming, in Colorado, in Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota.
Wow.
I'm going by order letters that Henry McKenna received from these places. As the railroad tracks went across Kansas, the order letters to Henry McKenna's distillery followed the tracks. And they would say, ship to this particular railroad depot or this railroad stop. If they didn't have, if they were 15
Yeah.
railroad track, they would go to the railroad depot and get the whiskey that Henry McKenna sent to that recipe, to that address. Texas, as the railroads went across Texas, you could see the orders coming to the McKenna distillery from West Texas, from railroad towns, and from New Mexico, south of Santa Fe, a town called Cerrillos, little mining town there, small iron ore deposits, but also other things, zinc and lead and a certain amount of silver and so on. Cerrillos was a boom town for a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades. And in Henry McKenna's letters on letterhead from Cerrillos, New Mexico, in about 1906, something like that, is an order from a bar, a fellow by the name of Crenshaw, who has a bar in Cerrillos, and he wants to carry Henry McKenna whiskey in Cerrillos, New Mexico.
This is amazing because, even going back to Nevada, the town we were talking about, actually, they changed their name to Yerington. They had 3 names, and they changed their name to Yerington, trying to lure the head of the railroad out in their area to put the railroad in Yerington, and it never happened. But they're next to Reno and Carson City's around the corner, which is the capital. And when you think about where their location is, they're right on the California Overland Trail, right part, near the Oregon Trail. The Pony Express traveled through their country. So it's really interesting when you think about where the railroads, like Tombstone, Arizona, was a mining town, but there was a lady we interviewed a few years ago, like over a decade, she talked about the food of Tombstone, Arizona,
Mhm.
the land of the OK Corral fight, and in the tents, these restaurants they had oysters, they had all these fancy lobster, the whiskey. I mean, we've been to all the saloons there, trust me. It's not that many, but there's all of that history, and it seems to be where that was what's going on in the West. They have the mines, and the miners want their whiskey at the end of the day, and they want to go gamble. They need, they have to, it is part of medicine, like you said, so that's part of that thing. So that's really neat.
It's elixir.
And when you said West Texas, it's interesting because we were just in Bandera County in the Texas Hill Country, also, famous for their wines. But their courthouse in Bandera, Texas, which is the cowboy capital of the world. So had the big thing with all the cattle coming up and down, or back and forth, up and down from Canada down. They have the same courthouse, and I think it's in Lexington or Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two. Some famous architect, there's like this history of these two courthouses being the same design. It's like they're the identical twins, and it goes back to some crazy story that we haven't, unearthed yet. So I wonder about, how did you get the courthouses? I know it's going to connect back to bourbon somewhere. Cowboys need bourbon too. Just that connection from way back then, it's fascinating. Railroads did a lot.
If you put this whole business of accessibility, in other words, 19th century, the railroad is nearby, it's headed literally in your direction. You want it to come to your town or your property, whatever it is. Multiply that times several 100,000 individuals who are trying to gain access to this grid that's going to give them markets, going to give them products that they can import and so on. You roll all that together, and that's what I would refer to as the plugging in ceremony. When the railroad comes to town, you're plugged in, if you will. Now you're part of this national grid, international, because now you have access to the Pacific coast, the Atlantic coast, and the world to build on your oyster metaphor there.
Yeah, it's still there.
America's first great plugging in ceremony, arguably, was the connecting of the Central Pacific Railroad with its western counterpart, with the Golden Spike.
Spike, yeah.
Golden Spike.
It's the Golden Barrel. It's not the Golden Spike.
That's the great, well-publicized plugging in ceremony. But there were thousands more of these when the railroad arrived, and suddenly Mr. Crenshaw in Cerrillos, New Mexico is plugged in, and he can order Henry McKenna whiskey from 1,200 miles away and have it arrive a few days later by railroad. How good for business is that?
That's amazing. And now it's become such a huge, all that marketing, and you think about marketing from way back when through to now. When you think of Kentucky, that's, you think about, the bluegrass, you think about music, but you really, some people think of Corvettes, and horses, obviously, right? Horses, and mint juleps, but bourbon is at the forefront and has also become a tourism scene. So it's not just imbibing and getting the bourbon out, but it's bringing people physically into the state, which is financially, it's huge. It's a good tourism and creates a lot of jobs. You talk about that in your books, how economically important bourbon is to the state.
Right. Well, for present day, obviously, it's hugely important, but that importance began really in the mid to late 19th century, and as people plugged in, they got onto the railroad track. Distilleries, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, by about 1870, 1880, were seeing the railroad track. Let's take Nelson County, where Bardstown is as an example. We're seeing the railroad bypass Bardstown and take a route off to the west. And then later on, a sidetrack was laid that went down to Lebanon and Springfield that you're familiar with. and bypass Bardstown again. Well, that road to the south of Bardstown ran through a little town called New Haven. And New Haven today is Kentucky's Railroad Museum. And it's about 15 miles, 18 miles south of Bardstown. And if you follow that track about 15 miles east, you would pass by at least 10 distilleries that moved from their rural surroundings to the railroad track. So they could be plugged in on that track. Eventually went to Springfield and then the Crab Orchard, eventually down to Knoxville, Tennessee. So all of those people wanted to be plugged in, if you will. So to do it, they didn't get the railroad to build a track to their distillery. They moved to the tracks. Now,
Wow.
think about that for a second.
That's industrious.
Yes, that's a big job.
Yeah.
That is.
Think about that in terms of the first question that Nancy asked, I think it was. Why is all this here? What about the rationale? Well, water is a consideration. So let's go back to that question. If water is the reason why distilling is in Kentucky, we pick up the distilleries now, we move them to the railroad tracks. Isn't the presumption that the same quality water is available at the railroad tracks as where you had put the distillery in the beginning? And if you move it 1 mile or if you move it 14 miles, what's to say that the water at the railroad track is equally as good as your original distillery site? So that challenges that question immediately.
That's interesting because we did a lot of wine tasting and interviewing with winemakers in Colorado, up in the northwest corner, and it's Colorado's wine country. Exceptional wine. Why? Well, because of the Colorado Plateau. And if you go to each winery, because they're on this plateau and then they have the Colorado River, their wines, obviously they are definitely each unique in, like we're talking about, with recipes and their own way of making it, their own craftsmanship. But it changed, the microclimate changed so much according to where they were situated in regards to the cliffs, like they had Mount Garfield and the Book Cliffs. I mean, you've got this it's like high desert, and then you've got this lush lower region of the water coming through from the Colorado River. You could have a winery 3 miles from each other, and the microclimates have changed, and even the water will be changed because of what it's running through. You know, the geology of it all, the sediments changes. So I'm sure it's the same for the bourbon. Yeah, this is interesting. Wow. I want some bourbon now, and then we're interviewing in the morning. Next time we need to do it with bourbon.
Yeah, this is how you should teach history class in high school. Just talk about whiskey and all the kids would listen.
They'll understand a little bit more because
Yeah.
I mean, you've got the history of the world connected to this, you know, and you think about,
Absolutely.
I do want to ask this, and this may be one of my dumb questions, and I know no questions are dumb, but I'm getting myself twirled around on history here. So Kentucky has such rich, a lot of Civil War history, Revolutionary War history that came through. And at some point, weren't the territories, like, weren't you at one point part Tennessee? Didn't those lines blur a little bit? And if so, did that affect the industry for bourbon? Like, was at some time where Kentucky bourbon makers actually in Tennessee, or the other way around?
I'm not aware of the Tennessee connection.
Okay. Was it Virginia? I've got myself twirled around them geographically.
There you are. Yeah, Kentucky was a county of Virginia.
Okay.
And it was very soon divided into 3 counties of Virginia, and then subsequently over time, Kentucky today has 120 counties that those original 3 counties were divided up into as population increased and people wanted to be reasonably close to their courthouse to do legal business and not have to drive for a week to get there, as you would
Right.
only have 3 counties in the whole state. So it would be fair to say that until Kentucky became a state in 1792, it was part of Virginia. And it would be fair to say that Virginia law, whatever aspect of law we're talking about, well, to use an example, we talked about turnpike construction a few minutes ago. Well, Virginia had turnpike law on its books. And when Kentucky became a state in 1792, it adapted very much, almost word for word in some cases, Virginia's turnpike road law. So they hit the ground running, you might say, in terms of providing legal statutes whereby people who wanted to get together and form a company to build a road, the county did not build roads, the state did not build roads. That came much, much later. If you wanted a road, you built it yourself. In other words, you had to raise the money, you had to form a little company of people who would invest. You would then sell shares to other people who would invest in building your road. Then you built the road. And it had to meet certain criteria. It had to be so wide, the rock layer had to be so deep. You couldn't put toll houses any closer together than 5 miles. And you couldn't put a toll house closer than 1 mile to a town.
Wow.
And we hired a state engineer who had been involved in the construction of the Erie Canal and a number of other major canal-river improvement projects, railroad improvement projects in Pennsylvania. Kentucky succeeded in hiring him away from Pennsylvania. He became our first state engineer. He in turn hired highway engineers, and they are making this law, this Virginia law, now Kentucky law, work in terms of how roads were constructed. So there are those connections to Virginia, as well as large numbers of migrants who, for various reasons, whether they be poor as church mice or the wealthiest person in Culpeper County, Virginia, are going to come to central Kentucky looking for better land or land that they received because they had political connections or for whatever reason. And all the reports coming back first from explorers and then from relatives or friends that had made the move to Kentucky, the letters that they send back saying, this place is heaven on earth. You've got to come here and invest, because this place is going places in the common vernacular. And, so there are those connections as well. So if we look at the Pepper Distillery, which is downtown Lexington here, undergoing refurbishment right now. It's a post-prohibition distillery complex, to go back to our interest in what happens before and after Prohibition. The Pepper Distillery, if we follow a couple of generations earlier, is started by a fellow by the name of Culpeper from Culpeper County, Virginia. He changes his name, he drops the Cul, and he becomes Mr. Pepper, and he establishes a distillery on Glens Creek, not very far from present-day Woodford Reserve. LaBrown and Graham Distillery on the same creek. Not very far from that is the present-day rehabilitated Castle and Key Distillery. That is the old Eh Taylor Distillery, formerly known as Old Taylor. So we have Culpeper's distillery in there with that whole complex of things. So there are connections like that with Virginia, just as there are connections with Scotland and Ireland.
When you talk about, here's someone down the creek, here's my distillery, and up the creek's another distillery. Water is like, the lifeline of the world. And you've got to keep your water clean. It's like, don't dirty up my creek. I'm trying to keep my language clean here. So was that also important in regards to, don't be kind to each other's water, otherwise it's going to ruin all of our bourbon.
That is a major issue when we transfer from craft distilling to industrial distilling. An industrial distiller is going to use a lot of water, consume a lot of grain, and let's make the assumption that the threshold for being called an industrial distiller is to process 100 bushels of grain, wheat, rye, barley, and so on per day during your distilling season. Well, the water you're using is about 44 gallons per bushel of grain. And so when you mix all of that together and you're fermenting it, and you go through fermentation, now if you go through distillation, what you distill out of that is the alcohol. What you're left with is the remaining of that 44 gallons of water per bushel of grain. And if we assume we have 100 bushels of grain, that's 4,400 gallons of leftover water, grain, fines, particles of grain that are left over after you've captured this starch and turned it into sugar. So what do you do with 4,400 gallons per day of hot wastewater? It's called slop in the industry. And if you have a country background like I do, raised on a farm, that term slop meant slopping the hogs.
I was going to say, yeah, bring the pigs.
And farm slop is generated a number of ways, but in the distilling industry, it is what's left over when you combine the water and all of that milled grain, and you have all those little particles of the husk, if there's husk left on your rye, for example, various pieces of fine corn that are not starch are left. Now, as it turns out, livestock, especially cattle and hogs, but to a certain extent also mules, thrive on this stuff if you can find a way to get it to them and to feed them. And so this becomes a major industry, that is bringing livestock to a distillery, an industrial distillery now. And if you're
getting the pigs drunk.
if you're consuming as much as 300, 400, 500 bushels a day, 400 bushels of grain times 44 gallons of water is what, 17,400 gallons of water. Did I do that right? That's
Don't ask me. I need bourbon for that.
That's approximately right. So every day you have to get rid of 17,000 gallons of byproduct. What do you do with it? Well, if you haven't gotten into the feeding of livestock, you either have to give it to somebody, and maybe the neighboring farmers are willing to bring their barrels over to your distillery and take a few barrels worth and haul it home and give it to or feed it to their livestock, or dump it in the creek.
Yikes.
That's what happened early on, especially if you're a small scale craft distiller. You're processing a dozen bushels of grain a day. What does it matter if you throw the slop into the creek? Well, it matters, as Lisa said a few minutes ago, if there's another distillery downstream that's trying to pull fresh water out of the creek, and downstream from that, and downstream from that, and so on. And this is the case with the New Haven area that I mentioned a few minutes ago. You have 10 distilleries originally lined up along a creek, Pottinger Creek in this case.
Wow.
Moved to the railroad track. On Glens Creek, you have several distilleries lined up. a railroad track came through the valley to connect them, to plug them in, if you will. But the valley was so narrow and so tight, they couldn't really move away. So they had to figure out other ways of dealing with the slop problem. And there were a lot of complaints in the local newspaper. And we treat this at length in the book. There's a whole chapter in the Making Bourbon book on byproducts and what do you do with it? How do you solve the problem? Some distillers in Louisville were taken to court using common law. People were able to claim this is a nuisance because it was stinking up Beargrass Creek in eastern Louisville. And so nuisance law comes into, and distillers now have something else they have to pay attention to, and that is how much of a mess are they making downstream. And solve that issue by bringing in cattle and hogs, and you build big barns, which is what they did, big barns to shelter their cattle or shelter their hogs, and they're feeding slop from the beginning of the distilling season, maybe late November, middle November, to let's say May. That's a lot of slop. So there are going to be cattle and hogs being fed. This is the beginning in a way of the American feedlot, which is very common today, especially out in the Great Plains. Livestock are not sanitary animals if in by themselves.
Right.
They have to be tended if they're going to be sanitary. And so you get the obvious problem with, pardon me, animal waste. How are you going to take care of that? Now you've got not only slop to manage, but now you've got animal waste to manage. And if your barns are right beside the creek, then that becomes a problem. And there was a case in a town east of here, in the inner bluegrass, where there was a distillery upstream from town. And before they put in their cattle and hog operation, they were dumping their slop into the creek. Well, the creek was a town water supply. So the town is protesting and taking to court and so on and so forth. And eventually they put in livestock, and that solves part of the problem. But now you have the other part of the problem with the livestock presence.
Wow.
So this becomes an ongoing issue, and it adds to the point that we were talking about several minutes back about how does one stay in business? How does one manage all of these difficulties over a period of multiple generations, such that you come down today where you have this master industry that has a worldwide reputation for a high quality product, and yet historically you've had to overcome all of these difficulties in order to make that business continue down to the present.
That's called entrepreneurship, man. It's perseverance and commitment, and you've got to have some passion. And at the end of the day, you need to have some bourbon. I think.
Yes, you do.
You do. You're gonna definitely do. Karl, thank you so much. What a conversation. This is like an amazing history lesson on Kentucky, along with bourbon. So everyone, again, Karl's books, Making Bourbon. His latest one is Bourbon's Backroads, a journey through Kentucky's distilling landscape, again through Kentucky Press. So you can go to kentuckypress.com. The books are there, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all those places, but it's always cool to support the press itself. And again, it's Karl Raitz, and that's Karl for Karl and Raitz. He's a professor, so I'm, showing off that I can spell by reading my notes. But also, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Karl. Keep up with us at bigblendradio.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.